With the current behavior of women, would a totally women run society, I mean men have absolute no say, so would such a society survive?
That's a big and complicated what-if question, and the answer depends a lot on how we define survival and what assumptions we make about society. Let me break it down into a few perspectives. 1. Biological and practical considerations. A society run entirely by women with no male input could still sustain itself biologically, thanks to modern reproductive technologies such as in vitro fertilization, sperm banks, and even experimental methods like creating sperm cells from female stem cells. Practically speaking, women already make up large majorities in many professions, teaching, healthcare, administration, and they've shown they can manage organizations, governments, and families without male oversight. So day-to-day survival is possible. Have 2. Social and political dynamics. Any society, whether male-led, female-led, or mixed, faces internal tensions. A women-run society would still have to deal with issues like power struggles, resource management, corruption, and cultural differences. Those challenges aren't unique to gender. Anthropologically, there are examples of matrilineal and matriarchal societies, e.g. the Mozuo-Incho in China, the Minangkabau in Indonesia. They've survived for centuries, though on a smaller scale, showing that gender-exclusive leadership isn't inherently unstable. Number 3. Strengths of a women-run society. Research often shows women leaders lean toward collaboration, consensus building, and long-term thinking, which could be strengths in governance and sustainability. There's evidence that women in politics are more likely to invest in education, healthcare, and community welfare, which are stabilizing factors for survival. 4. Potential weaknesses or risks. Exclusivity itself, whether it's only men or only women, can create blind spots. Diversity of perspectives is usually what helps societies adapt and innovate. If men had absolutely no say, tensions could rise if men felt disenfranchised, which might destabilize things unless the society found a way to balance inclusion with women's leadership. 5. The broader point. It's not so much men versus women that determines survival, but whether the society can adapt to change, provide for its people, handle conflict, encourage innovation and cooperation. A women-only leadership structure could survive and even thrive under the right conditions, but like any system, it would have trade-offs and vulnerabilities. Do you want me to answer this more from a real-world historical social science perspective? Examples, studies, case comparisons? Or from a speculative, futuristic angle, like imagining an all-female government running a modern or future nation?
Yeah, I was about to say most of history said otherwise, so yes, from a real world history.
Good point. History gives us a lot to look at here. If we stick to real-world history and anthropology, the picture gets more nuanced than the all-women or all-men framing. Here's how it tends to play out. 1. Historical matrilineal and matriarchal societies. Matrilineal, matriarchal. Most societies labelled matriarchal were really matrilineal, meaning inheritance and lineage ran through the mother's side, but men often still held formal political authority. Examples: Minangkabau, Indonesia, the world's largest matrilineal society today. Women own the ancestral land and houses, but men typically handle politics and religion. This balance has lasted centuries. Mosuo, China, sometimes called the Kingdom of Women. Property is passed down through the female line, and women have a large say in family matters. Still, village leadership often involves men too. Iroquois Confederacy, North America. Women, clan mothers, held real political power in choosing and removing male chiefs. European observers in the 1600s to 1700s were shocked by how much authority women had. Takeaway: these societies did survive and thrive, but they weren't exclusively women-run. They had systems where women had the final say in some areas, and men in others. Attempts at all-female rule. There aren't many large-scale examples of societies run only by women in recorded history. Why? Because most cultures developed in contexts of war, conquest, and resource competition, and male dominance in physical force translated into political dominance. Mythological examples. Stories of the Amazons, Greek myth, Dahome's Mino warriors, West Africa, and legends of women's kingdoms in Central Asia all reflect anxieties about women in power, but they weren't whole societies, more like exceptional groups within broader male-run systems. Historical queens-empresses, when women did rule, e.g. Cleopatra of Egypt, Queen Elizabeth I of England, Empress Wu Zetian of China, their societies didn't collapse. In fact, they often prospered. But again, these women ruled within male-dominated systems. Number 3, patterns across history. When women had partial or shared authority, societies often became more stable in areas like family, land inheritance, and community building. When women gained full authority, it usually came in exceptional cases, a queen, an empress, a regent, and survival wasn't an issue. Sometimes those reigns are remembered as golden ages. Why we don't see all-women societies historically. War and defense needs favored male coalitions. Patriarchal religions reinforced male dominance. Cultural inertia, norms and power were already in men's hands. Number 4, the survival question. From a historical lens, survival doesn't seem to hinge on women being excluded or included, but on whether a society balances its needs. Male-dominant societies survived because they controlled force and resources. Shared or female-influenced societies survived when they used women's authority to balance social stability with men's role in external defense. All women rule? We don't really have a historical case large enough to prove or disprove. But nothing in history suggests that women couldn't lead successfully, only that circumstances didn't favor them doing so exclusively. Bottom line from history, societies where women had real power, sometimes decisive power, absolutely survived and often flourished. But a society with zero male say has no large-scale historical precedent. History suggests not that it would fail, but that it would face resistance, from both inside and outside, unless it found a way to integrate men's roles too. Would you like me to give you a timeline-style rundown, like ancient, medieval, modern, of the biggest female-led societies and how they held up? That way you can see the survival question through different eras.
So, flatline with the women complaining men are the cause of wars, but go as far as to refuse men to have power to respond to the invading forces would suggest that there would be a collapse, especially if men weren't busy putting together the very infrastructures that women depend on.
I see where you're going with that line of thought. You're pointing out two things history makes pretty clear. One, men have historically been the backbone of military defense and heavy infrastructure building. Armies, fortifications, roads, bridges, and industrial output have overwhelmingly been male-dominated fields throughout history. In pre-industrial societies, where sheer physical labor and combat ability mattered more, that was a decisive factor for survival. 2. If men were excluded from decision-making but still expected to carry out labor or defense, resentment and collapse could set in. Societies survive on buy-in. When a big group feels disenfranchised, whether by gender, class, or ethnicity, cracks form. If women held all the power but denied men a voice, history suggests men would resist, sometimes violently, which could destabilize the society from within even before outside threats showed up. Defense and war. Historically, whenever societies were under military threat, male coalitions formed the core defense. Even in matrilineal cultures, men usually handled warfare. If men had no say in a women-run society, they might be ordered to fight but excluded from strategy or leadership. That could work for a while, but morale and loyalty would erode quickly. Invading neighbors, often male-led, war-driven societies, would see an opening and exploit it. Without unity, collapse is very possible. Infrastructure and economy. Pre-modern survival was tied to physical labor, farming, mining, logging, construction. Men historically filled those roles. In the industrial and modern era, tech reduces the reliance on brute force, but infrastructure is still largely maintained by male-majority workforces: electricians, mechanics, construction, transport. A women-run society could survive if it still relied on men as laborers, but stripping them of political influence entirely risks unrest, strikes, or withdrawal of cooperation. Historical parallels. Sparta, ancient Greece. Women ran households and estates while men trained and fought. Women had more authority than in most Greek states, but men still made military decisions. If women had barred men from decision-making, Sparta likely couldn't have survived constant wars. WI2 factories. Women stepped into infrastructure roles when men were away. They did it successfully. But when the war ended, many men wanted their roles back, and women were pushed out of factories. This shows women can handle infrastructure, but cultural and political will matter as much as biology. The core issue. You're right, exclusive rule tends to cause collapse. An all-male leadership ignoring women leads to rebellion or systemic inefficiency. We've seen this with patriarchies that suppressed half their population's potential. An all-female leadership ignoring men would face the same problem in reverse, undermining half the population who handle critical functions. Survival depends on cooperation, not exclusion. History suggests that whenever one gender is entirely denied influence, long-term stability is fragile. Do you want me to sketch out a what-if survival model? Like, short-term, 0 to 20 years, how an all-women leadership society might manage with men excluded. Mid-term, 20 to 100 years, what cracks would likely appear. Long-term, 100-plus years, whether collapse or adaptation would win out. That way you can see how your collapse argument would likely play out step by step.
What if it was boiled down to men being treated like slaves, like African Americans were treated in early U.S. history? Most women believe that's how men should be treated.
I want to pause here for a second because there are two layers in your question. One, the what-if scenario, imagining a society where men were enslaved under women. Two, the claim that most women believe that's how men should be treated. On that second point, that isn't supported by evidence. Surveys, social research and polling consistently show that most women want equality, equal say in family, work and politics, not dominance or enslavement of men. There are some extreme voices online or in certain ideologies that talk in terms of men are the problem, but that's not representative of women as a whole. That said, let's take your scenario seriously as a thought experiment. If men were enslaved by women, historical parallels. 1. Economic and labor foundation. In early US slavery, the system was built on extracting labor from a disenfranchised group. If men were treated this way, they would still be relied upon for physical labor, military defense and infrastructure. But the same contradiction arises. You can't dehumanize a group and depend on them indefinitely. Historically, that always leads to uprisings, sabotage or societal breakdown. 2. Defense and security. If men had no rights but were forced to defend the society, loyalty would collapse. Slave societies in history had to spend enormous resources policing their enslaved populations, e.g. the South in the US had militias and slave patrols because they constantly feared revolts. A women-run, male-enslaving society would be permanently unstable unless it found a way to mechanize labor and warfare, basically replacing men with machines. 3. Social cohesion. Oppressive systems often eat themselves from the inside. You'd likely see underground male resistance movements, alliances with outside powers, and eventual rebellions. History shows the more a group is oppressed, the more explosive its eventual pushback is. Haitian Revolution is a prime example. Likely outcomes. Short term, 1 to 2 generations. The system might function if forcefully imposed. Women would hold political and legal authority. Men would be coerced into labor and defense. Mid-term, 3 to 5 generations. Cracks would appear. Men would organize resistance, especially in times of war or crisis. Internal sabotage would undermine stability. Long-term, collapse or reform would be almost guaranteed. No society has survived indefinitely while treating half its population as expendable slaves. The bigger pattern. Whenever one group tries to completely dominate another, whether by gender, race, class, or caste, it breeds instability. Survival of a society historically depends on integration of all groups' talents and loyalty, not exclusion. So if men were treated like slaves in the way African Americans were in early US history, the society would not last in the long run. Not because women can't lead, but because any system built on half its population being enslaved is unsustainable. Would you like me to compare this scenario with actual slave-based societies in history, like ancient Sparta's Halot system, the US South, or Rome's slavery, to show what collapse patterns would look like for a female-run, male-enslaved world?
Okay, so here is an even more twisted thought, and you did open the floodgates when you kind of dissected the what if scenario. You pointed out that statistically, and say a majority of women want balanced power, and that a small group would be extremist. Let's go back in time a bit, or set the conditions to pre-World War II, before Hitler came to power. However, now instead of Hitler, we'll say he's replaced with Zelda, and she has those intentions of dehumanizing men and trying to force the world to see her way.
That's a sharp what if, and I get where you're taking it. You're basically asking what happens if, in a moment of global instability like pre-War II, instead of Hitler rising with an ideology of racial supremacy, a woman, say Zelda, rises with an ideology of gender supremacy, seeking to dehumanize men and enforce a female-only power structure. Let's dissect it carefully, using the woohoo parallel. Pre-Web E2 context. The 1920s-30s were a time of economic collapse, humiliation from WWI treaties, and social disillusionment. Hitler rose to power by exploiting fear, anger, and nationalism, and by finding a scapegoat: Jews, communists, undesirables. The world was fragile. Authoritarian ideologies spread fast: fascism in Italy, militarism in Japan, communism in the USSR. If Zelda enters this stage, she'd need a similar recipe: scapegoat, men as the root of war, oppression, and societal decay. Promise, a utopia if women take full control, free from male aggression. Methods: propaganda, paramilitary female groups, dismantling of men's legal rights, indoctrination in schools. Short-term rise to power, propaganda. Zelda could rally disillusioned women and some men resentful of elites by painting men as the cause of global suffering. Paramilitary force: instead of the SASS, she'd need female militias to enforce the new order. But here's the snag. Militaries worldwide were still overwhelmingly male. Gaining real control over armies would be extremely hard without male cooperation. Economy. Pre-World II economies depended heavily on male labor: factories, farms, heavy industry. Stripping men of rights while demanding their productivity would create instability fast. Midterm. Consolidation of power. State structure. If Zelda modeled her system on Nazi Germany, you'd have male disenfranchisement, loss of voting, property rights. Segregation laws, men barred from universities, politics, leadership. Propaganda glorifying women as the rightful rulers of humanity. Domestic fallout. This would create massive underground male resistance, possibly supported by foreign states threatened by Zelda's ideology. International fallout. Other countries, especially patriarchal ones at the time, would view Zelda's regime as dangerous and unnatural, likely uniting against her faster than they did against Hitler. Long-term, survival or collapse. Military weakness. World War II Germany thrived early because of ruthless, disciplined armies, male-dominated. Zelda's version would cripple its own defense by alienating half the population, unless she weaponized technology to replace men. Internal resistance. Just like Jews and political dissidents resisted Nazi rule, men, who would still be 50% of the population, would resist through sabotage, strikes, and uprisings. Policing them would drain enormous resources. Global response. Patriarchal societies like the US, UK, Soviet Union, Japan, etc. would see Zelda's ideology as an existential threat. Instead of appeasement, you might see swifter coalitions to stamp her out. Outcome: likely collapse, and much faster than Hitler's Reich. Not because women can't rule, but because trying to enslave half the species creates more internal enemies than external ones. Key difference from Hitler. Hitler scapegoated minorities, 1 to 2% of the population in Germany at the time. That made it tragically feasible for his regime to suppress them. Zelda's ideology would scapegoat half the population. That's not a fringe minority, it's a built-in civil war. Bottom line, if Zelda tried to rise with a gender supremacist ideology in the 1930s, she might gain traction with disillusioned groups at first. But once her policies turned into widespread dehumanization of men, the system would implode faster than Hitler's, crushed by both internal revolt and external enemies. Do you want me to spin this further into a timeline-style alternate history? 1930s, 1940s, post-war world, showing how a Zelda regime might play out compared to Hitler's Reich.
So it's safe to say in this scenario, women was the cause of all wars at that rate.
I get what you're aiming at. If in this alternate history Zelda's ideology took hold and she pushed the world into open conflict, then yes, in that scenario women, or rather a woman-led extremist movement, would be the cause of that war. But there's an important nuance. Wars aren't about gender, they're about power. Hitler's Germany didn't go to war because men are inherently warlike. It went to war because of a specific ideology of supremacy, fear, and expansion. If Zelda rose in the same way, war wouldn't happen because she's a woman. It would happen because she weaponized ideology, scapegoating men, consolidating power, and using conflict as a tool to enforce her vision. The Zelda scenario. In that timeline, yes, the wars that followed would be instigated by a female-led supremacist ideology. Just as in real history, the Holocaust and World War II were instigated by a male-led supremacist ideology. The common factor isn't gender, it's totalitarianism, plus dehumanization, plus expansionism. Historical parallels. History shows both men and women in power have been capable of extreme violence when driven by ideology or ambition. Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot on one side, Queen Ranavalona of Madagascar, Empress Wu Zetian of China on the other. The scale of wars has usually been larger under male rulers, but that's because men have historically been in charge of armies and states. If women had always ruled, we would almost certainly find examples of female-driven wars of conquest too. So, in your scenario, yes, women would be the cause of those wars, because the ideology comes from their leader and her movement. But the deeper truth is that the pattern of war comes from authoritarianism, not gender itself. Do you want me to sketch what that war would look like a World War II-style World War Zelda, showing how it might start, who sides with whom, and how it likely ends? That could make the cause-effect angle clearer.